The Star Wars Sequel Trilogy is without question one of the most divisive, controversial, and disappointing cinematic trilogies of all time. No trilogy from memory has ever managed to generate so much hype, so much pandemonium, just a complete takeover of the pop culture zeitgeist like the sequel trilogy managed to do. Billions of dollars at the box office, the domestic box office record which still stands to this day, and levels of relevance that the IP realistically hadn't seen in nearly 40 years. But within the space of a few years, it all managed to nosedive to a point where people just didn't care anymore. Between 2015 to 2019, Star Wars went from being a juggernaut to a laughingstock. After so much promise and a complete hijacking of the pop culture zeitgeist for a few years, everything changed. The sequel trilogy completely derailed for a multitude of reasons. The promise of a compelling mystery and reintroduction to George Lucas's beloved creation for a new generation was set for greatness, but it all imploded in on itself in spectacular fashion. And I find it endlessly entertaining how things managed to fail so spectacularly. Now, I've talked about Star Wars on my channel before, however, I have never made a video dedicated on the sequel trilogy itself. When the clocks turned over in 2025 a couple months ago, it actually hit me that it had been basically 5 years since I'd seen any of the sequels. Reason being, I absolutely grew to despise them. So because I hate myself, I wanted to revisit them to see if I felt any different after all this time, and I've got to say, I was surprised by how I felt about this trilogy. One of the 3 films in particular, I had a drastic change in opinion. So drastic, in fact, I decided to make this video, so make sure you watch all the way through. So in this video, we're going to revisit the sequel trilogy. We're going to go film by film, taking a trip down memory lane and getting to the bottom of what the hell went wrong, what went right, and how a trilogy that had the world at its feet managed to turn into a laughingstock. This is going to be a really long video, so sit back, relax as we take a retrospective look at the Star Wars sequels in 2025. On October 30th, 2012, Star Wars changed forever. George Lucas signed Lucasfilm over to Disney for $4 billion in that now infamous video. It's just one of the toughest things to watch given how far Star Wars has fallen. And Disney, being Disney, wasted no time once acquiring the rights to Lucasfilm to get a new Star Wars trilogy in development. Star Wars was going to be hitting theaters once again for a whole new generation, a trilogy that promised to unite Star Wars fans both young and old, to return to the franchise roots of the original trilogy and stray away a little bit from the style of the prequels. As, believe it or not, the general consensus of the prequels back in 2015 was significantly more negative than it is now in 2025. It was revealed that the film would be called The Force Awakens, a fitting title, and would be directed by J.J. Abrams. And when that first trailer released in November 2014, I, like many people, were absolutely sold on this new trilogy. Star Wars was back, and it was front and center in the pop culture zeitgeist once again, proving before the film had even released just how strong the Star Wars name still was around the world. In December of 2015, The Force Awakens released to very strong reviews from both critics and fans. The film was dominating the box office, it was shattering records, crossing over $2 billion and setting a new domestic box office record, which, as I said earlier, still has never been topped. I remember this time very well. There was simply no better time to be a Star Wars fan after The Force Awakens release. Star Wars hysteria was at a high it hadn't seen since the release of the original trilogy almost 40 years prior. Theories were everywhere and speculation fueled the fandom, and Disney truly could not have got things off to a better start. Now, was The Force Awakens a perfect movie? No, it was very much so a modern rehash of A New Hope, which was just about the main criticism the detractors of the movie had. But most people weren't really overly bothered by that because The Force Awakens did it pretty well and added a few new twists and turns that had people wondering where things would go next. The Force Awakens managed to ease us back into the Star Wars universe. Bringing back John Williams to compose the film definitely helped with this. But not only was there a new cast of characters for a whole new generation to latch onto, but the nostalgia was strong with this film too. Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill, and Carrie Fisher all reprised their roles as our iconic characters, with even Anthony Daniels returning as C-3PO and Peter Mayhew returning as Chewie. They managed to find a perfect balance of new and old to unite Star Wars fans for once, and they generally managed to do it pretty well. Now, it might sound like I'm erring on the side of severe positivity here so far when I've already made it clear that I absolutely hate this trilogy, but the thing is, people love to rewrite history and act like the general consensus wasn't overly positive when this film came out. Regardless of where the trilogy ended up and how much things deteriorated by its conclusion, The Force Awakens was received extremely well and was deemed an overwhelming success both critically and financially on all metrics. I have seen many people since the release of The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker try and act like everyone hated this movie when it came out from the get-go, which is obviously just not true. As I said, people love to rewrite history and people have been doing it for a while with the sequels. I'm not going to do that. I'm aware of what reality was back when this film came out. And I'm not going to pretend like it was the inverse just because of how far things fell off with episodes 8 and 9. But let's turn our focus to the analysis of the movie itself and step away from the external conversation. The Force Awakens, I believe, is still to this day the best of the sequel trilogy by a mile. Reason being, it doesn't do a whole lot wrong. As I said, it plays it safe and it keeps it almost beat for beat with A New Hope. You've got the little guy going up against the big guy, our hero coming from a sand planet, the mentor figure coming and going, trench runs and killing the planet-sized weapon. It's not shy in its attempts to run clear parallels with A New Hope. And you know, A New Hope is a great movie, so this never really bothered me. Keep in mind, this film's job was to ease us back into Star Wars after what had been a pretty turbulent period. And I thought when it did stray away from what came before, it was extremely interesting. J.J. Abrams' mystery box storytelling is kind of the best and worst thing about this movie. The mystery inserted here is excellent in isolation, but in the context of the trilogy, it was almost impossible to pay off in a satisfying way, especially when you're dealing with multiple filmmakers in the trilogy, including one in particular that was hell-bent on retconning what came before, or just not paying anything off at all. The new cast of characters, looking back on it now, it's honestly tough to sit through The Force Awakens knowing that just about every single new character's potential was completely wasted in this trilogy. The Force Awakens is a tough watch these days, not because it's a bad movie, but because it's so obvious how much potential was thrown down the drain with these characters. The new trio of Rey, Finn, and Poe were all extremely interesting characters if you just look at it from this film alone. You've got Rey, the mysterious scavenger who's strong with the Force but doesn't have a clue why, hinting at potential special lineage. You've got Finn, a defected stormtrooper, which is such a great idea, something we hadn't seen before, and is also a person who insists on running from the fight, but his morals keep dragging him back into the fray. And you've got Poe Dameron, the hotshot pilot who has to rise to become a leader. This trio had so much potential, and it's clear when you revisit this movie, they had the building blocks there. It's just a shame that Rian Johnson kicked those blocks over in the next movie, but we'll get to that. So let's hone in on the characters here, starting with Rey, perhaps the most infamous Star Wars character that there is. Now, I don't even need to begin to mention why them making a Rey movie after all these years is a terrible idea. Anyone with a pulse can figure that out. Despite great potential, the damage to this character in this trilogy is basically irreversible. But man, I've got to say, the starting point for this character was interesting. I remember all the theorizing on who Rey's parents were, who was in that shuttle when she was left on Jakku, how could she beat Kylo Ren, how could she do this, how could she do that. The theorizing was fun. Now, it did become clear in the next two films that there was definitely a little bit of a sprinkle of strong female character Disney politics put in there, but the character in The Force Awakens I don't think was inherently bad at all. Were there times, especially given the context of her contrived lineage or lack thereof, depending on the movie you're watching, where it seems like she just has all the answers and didn't encounter enough struggle before succeeding? Yeah, sure. I think with this movie, they at least tried to make things somewhat make sense with how competent she is. Like when she flew the Falcon, everybody said, she can't do that, shoot her or something. Like, how could she just get in it and do what Han did in the original trilogy? A lot of people tend to omit the fact that she's scavenged ships like this her entire life, she knows how they work, and when she first starts flying it, she basically destroys half of Nima Outpost because she clearly doesn't know how to fly it like a master straight away like people keep making out she does. There's also the fact she beat Kylo Ren, which is obviously a massive spot of contention amongst fans and has been since this film came out. How can someone who's used the Force for one day beat someone who's significantly more powerful and trained for years? They tend to omit the fact that Kylo was shot in the stomach with a blaster that literally sent stormtroopers flying 10 feet in the air earlier in the movie, and The Last Jedi, to its credit, did mention why and how Kylo did lose to Rey. Plus, they did make a point of Finn holding his own against him, at least for a little while, to try and make it make sense that Kylo was clearly not in a good way and probably could have been knocked over by a strong breeze that day. Like, they at least did try to make things somewhat believable, but it is clear that leaps in logic had to be made to justify her competence and power. So I do think both sides of the coin, with Rey being a Mary Sue and her not being a Mary Sue, have a point with this film specifically. I'm not going to say you're wrong either way, but in the next two movies, it's pretty clearly skewed in one direction, and I don't think I need to mention which direction it is. But let's talk about Kylo Ren. He was and still is the best thing about the sequel trilogy. Now, I know there are really brain-dead people out there that love to say he's just a sad emo and are completely ignorant of any nuance this character has in this movie. Because this is the best character in the trilogy by a mile, which, to be fair, I know is not saying much, but it still counts for something. The comparisons to Darth Vader were inevitable for the new villain of the sequel trilogy, and the fact they addressed that head-on by making that comparison a key aspect of his character, his ability to live up to his grandfather, was a rare great decision that this trilogy made. Like, the potential of this character was insane. Not to mention, having an actor as great as Adam Driver in the role was excellent. I can't believe we had Adam Driver playing a main villain in a Star Wars trilogy, and it was fumbled. That will never not drive me insane. Now, Kylo's first appearance in The Force Awakens, I think, is criminally underrated, as it tells you everything you need to know about the character off the rip. Both Rey and Kylo's introductions do this so well. Kylo is powerful, but he's not perceived how he wants to be. During this scene, all of Kylo's lines are deliberate and demand respect. However, every line of dialogue from Max von Sydow's character completely deflects Kylo's intentions and focuses on something Kylo is clearly trying to avoid. Watch the scene back again. Just about every single line strays off topic from Kylo's dialogue and references back to who the man behind the mask is. This is a genius interaction that punches well above this trilogy's quality. The fact this character has no fear despite Kylo's forced intimidation acts as a perfect example of how Kylo as a character isn't taken seriously. He's this Darth Vader wannabe. Under the dark and scary facade of the mask is a confused and desperate imitation of his grandfather. I love that the creators decided to lean into fan comparisons by making it a cornerstone of the character. And when the movie plays with those ideas, I think that's when the small moments of brilliance this trilogy has shines through. I think for the most part, Kylo in this movie is a thumbs up. The moments where his artificial facade of Kylo Ren falls away and we see Ben Solo seep through is compelling. But it is hard to go back and watch The Force Awakens again to see a character filled with so much potential and played by such a great actor get criminally squandered. Now, as for Poe and Finn, I think these two characters are great in The Force Awakens specifically. Both fall off a cliff in the next two movies, Finn more so than Poe, but we'll get to that. They essentially took Han Solo from the original trilogy and cut him into two to create Poe and Finn. You have the hotshot pilot and calm and cool attitude of Han with Poe, and you have the reluctant hero turned eventual leader with Finn. As for how The Force Awakens treated the original trio, I know a lot of people over time have grown bitter on the fact that they killed Han Solo and they see it as disrespectful, but I think Han's death was handled the best out of the big three. Not to mention, Harrison Ford's been begging for this character to die for decades, and the man finally got his wish, and you don't say no to Harrison Ford. They definitely focused in on Han regressing as a smuggler and a father here, and for some people that was frustrating, but to be honest, I think this works for Han specifically. For me, it made Han a more three-dimensional character, more so than he was in the original trilogy, and I'm not saying he wasn't three-dimensional in the original trilogy or anything, don't mistake me, but I think this just made Han a better character in general, more depth. It made him feel a little bit more human, which helped with Kylo as a character as well. As for Leia, I think The Force Awakens handled her well. She's in line with the character she was in the original trilogy and is well respected and treated with respect by the filmmakers. As for Luke, well, we'll obviously get to that when we talk about The Last Jedi, but a large portion of this movie is how do we find Luke? Why did he disappear? For us to only see him right at the end. I have no problem with Luke isolating himself after a massive mistake, but I have a problem with how far they went with it in the next movie. Also, it's worth stating that the fact we didn't see Luke, Han, and Leia on screen at all in this trilogy is an absolute joke. I do not know how that happened. Now, you're probably seeing by this point that I think this movie did a good job in laying the foundations for the trilogy, and that is certainly the way I feel. Is it hard enjoying The Force Awakens in retrospect, knowing that any good setup it did was wasted or just went nowhere or was retconned? Yes. Like, it is hard enjoying the idea of Snoke in this movie when he just dies and then is apparently just a creation of Palpatine. It's hard enjoying Hux as an evil fascist asshole who's going to get his comeuppance because he's the spy.
I'm the spy.
It's also hard seeing lines from Mars regarding how she got Luke's lightsaber when she says it's a good story for another time, and we're still waiting for the other time. The Force Awakens is without question the best of the sequels for me, but it is tough to revisit because you have to see all of that squandered potential all over again. Like, we were on the verge of greatness, we were this close. But ultimately, The Force Awakens is just a story of wasted potential. It's not a perfect movie even in isolation, but what it was a great foundation for a great trilogy. But obviously, those foundations were chewed up and spat out by the next movie. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of the derailment of the sequels.
And here we go.
The Last Jedi, one of the most infamous movies of all time. I've got to say, I actually kind of liked this movie when I walked out of the midnight screening back in 2017, but I knew this film was going to be divisive when I checked one of my group chats and one of my friends had said that the film ruined his life and that he wanted to beat the shit out of George Lucas for allowing Disney to even make it. And then, of course, I went online and I saw how split the fandom was on this movie. Now, full transparency here, I did defend this movie for a little bit after it came out. I liked that it addressed the main complaint people had about The Force Awakens and went out and did something that we hadn't seen before. I liked that it challenged what we expected, made us question our heroes, and went for a non-conventional continuation. But as time went on and I watched the film more and more, I got a little older, a little bit smarter, and just could, add 2 and 2 together, I slowly started to realize that challenging the viewer and subverting expectations was just not worth destroying the trilogy's potential. So my journey with this movie has been interesting. I liked it originally, then I went on the fence and saw the good and the bad, and then I didn't watch it for 5 years, and now I have grown more cynical with this movie than I ever thought was possible. And I think that it mainly comes down to the fact of the knock-on effect this movie had on Star Wars as a whole. This was the film that led Star Wars to the irrelevant husk that it is today. Watching The Last Jedi for the first time since 2019, I have to say, I think this movie has dethroned The Rise of Skywalker as my least favorite of the 3 and my least favorite Star Wars film ever. I would go as far as to say that I actually hate this movie. If you want to know why the sequel trilogy fell apart, if you want to know why Star Wars is an irrelevant brand in 2025, if you want to know why The Rise of Skywalker was one of the most pathetic franchise films of all time, well, here's your answer. The Last Jedi. Now, I do not like The Rise of Skywalker at all, but that film is merely a symptom of The Last Jedi. You can hate The Rise of Skywalker for being a bad movie, and I'll agree with you, but the root cause of why The Rise of Skywalker is so bad is The Last Jedi. This is the movie that made it abundantly clear that Disney had no plan for this trilogy at all. Rian Johnson came in and made a film that did its own thing with no care for what it actually means for anything going on around it. The films that came before, the films that will come after, it was made as if those two things weren't important, which you can't do when you're making the middle film of a trilogy. Rian Johnson had something that he wanted to do, and he was going to do it regardless of whether or not it broke canon, whether or not it lined up with any vision the trilogy had. And I don't necessarily blame Rian Johnson for wanting to draw outside the lines of Star Wars with this movie, because as someone who has actually made a film myself, I understand wanting to push those barriers. To be honest, I blame Kathleen Kennedy and all those involved at Lucasfilm that are in charge of taking care of the canon and the continuity of Star Wars. Because these people allowed him to do this. Again, I get a filmmaker wanting to do something ambitious. I understand that, but sometimes they need to be reined in, and it's clear that that didn't happen with this movie. And when you're dealing with something as connected and beloved as Star Wars, it is your duty to keep filmmakers in line on their ambitions. Rian Johnson gets the hate for this movie because he's the one who made it, which rightly so, but every single person at Lucasfilm that lacked the ability to tell him no are just as responsible for this movie and the current state of Star Wars as he is. But now to actually analyze the movie itself, I will say this probably still is the best looking Star Wars movie ever made. It's got some wonky visuals in scenes on Canto Bight, but if you can ignore the absolute blasphemy this movie is trying to pull off, you can at least enjoy the visual mastery on display. Now, that mastery obviously didn't translate to the rest of the movie. So let's just rip the band-aid off with this one, and let's talk about Luke. I've never really talked about Luke in The Last Jedi on this channel in any great detail before, so this is kind of new ground for me, and I've got a lot to say. I originally didn't mind what they did with Luke in The Last Jedi, and the reason I say that is I thought it was interesting to play with the idea of Luke Skywalker, this legend, this higher-than-life figure being able to fail, but then realizes the error of his ways and then redeems his actions by the end. I liked him having to understand the lesson that failure is the biggest teacher in order to get himself back on track. At face value, Luke's arc in The Last Jedi is actually pretty great, but the problem is, this is an arc that shouldn't, and realistically, would never exist for this character specifically. Yes, we can all make mistakes, yes, we're all vulnerable to a moment of weakness, we are human, but the leap Rian Johnson took with this idea with Luke was too much to digest for most people. I like the ideas posed with Luke in this movie, and in a vacuum they're poignant and thought-provoking, but the problem is you're doing this with a character that was the embodiment of hope, that even in the most dire circumstances could see the good in anyone. The same person that saw the smallest shred of light in his father and was willing to face death in order to help redeem him. The same father that was responsible for the death of millions of people. The same father that helped create an oppressed galaxy which has had people living in fear and even blowing up planets. Rian Johnson expected us to believe that Luke could see the light and conflict in that person, but even in a fleeting moment would strike down his own nephew because he saw in Ben's dreams that Snoke had turned his heart, and Ben was eventually at some point going to do some bad stuff. This doesn't make sense. Remember when I said earlier that The Last Jedi doesn't care about if it breaks canon, that it doesn't respect what came before or what will come after? This is what I mean. Luke's arc could work well in The Last Jedi if the original trilogy didn't exist. Not to mention, how are we expected to believe that Luke would try and redeem Vader because he felt the conflict within him, that shred of light, but would think even for a moment to strike Ben down? Are you trying to tell me that Ben at this moment is completely lost to the dark side further than Vader ever was? No, and you can't say he was, because the entire sequel trilogy makes a very clear note that Kylo is conflicted, that he feels the pull to the light, so Luke switching on his lightsaber objectively makes no sense. How Luke can redeem Vader because he sensed conflict in him, but tries to kill the character that these movies constantly tell you is conflicted, makes no sense. This has been the most hotly debated topic with this movie, and I don't even think it should be. I think the conclusion here is pretty clear cut. I get we all have opinions, but people who try and make sense of this moment in The Last Jedi, please try and help me understand how this is supposed to make sense. You could pass this moment off as a brief failure of continuity and writing, but the problem is Luke's entire presence in this movie is built off this very moment. So you can't just brush it off as a weak moment in the writing. The entire film is built around this moment, and it doesn't make sense. Now, take Luke out of the equation. What about the rest of the movie? It's just not great. The First Order sit on the Resistance tail waiting for them to run out of fuel for the entire movie until the Resistance can sneak off down to Crate and then create an epic climactic battle. Whilst all of this is going on, Finn and Rose head to Canto Bight, which has been clowned on endlessly by almost everyone who has seen this movie, so I'm not going to add to that. But despite how much I despise the Canto Bight sequence, I do like the idea of looking into war profiteering and the moral grey area of some characters in the galaxy, like DJ, played by Benicio del Toro, who definitely made some weird choices with the character in his performance. But the idea of these war profiteers getting rich selling weapons to the bad guys and the good, and that Finn should live free and not join a side, I find that interesting. Because this bleeds into Finn's arc across both movies. His motivations are always selfish. The only reason he helps the Resistance in The Force Awakens is because of Rey. He was happy to run away from the fight until she was captured. His first words in The Last Jedi are, "Where's Rey?" He tries to leave the fight again until he's stopped by Rose. And now with DJ, his conflict of running or joining continues. That is until he is on Crate, where he has to make a decision. He decides to sacrifice himself to reaffirm his choice to complete his arc. But yeah, they throw that out the window because Rose saves him and the awkward kiss happens, and then Finn is relegated to screaming out Rey in episode 9 and doing absolutely nothing else. That's some mighty fine writing. Now, as for Rey, Kylo, and Snoke, I think these are some of the more enjoyable scenes in the movie, even though they are severely flawed and the whole subverting expectation thing comes to the forefront here. Now, I do like the dynamic of Rey and Kylo, as Kylo, again, is the best part about the trilogy. Having someone fuel the conflict he has definitely makes for the more interesting moments of these movies. I think him turning on Snoke and killing him just to become the Supreme Leader, though, just makes no sense, and is more of a middle finger to the audience for daring to have any interest in who Snoke was and what his backstory was. Remember the whole "your Snoke theory sucks" thing? How dare you theorize and speculate over the clearly set up to be mysterious character? How dare you, you stupid person. Now, I do not buy for 1 second that when they cast Andy Serkis to play this character for The Force Awakens, that they were like, yeah, you're gonna die halfway through the second movie. Killing Snoke was a cool scene, but it's just dumb, and honestly, is probably the key moment that completely obliterated this trilogy's continuity. Not to mention Kylo Ren's potential as a character. This scene should have taken place in episode 9, and that's where Kylo should have killed Snoke as Ben, a full redemption just like his grandfather did, sacrificing himself in his moment of redemption to destroy his master. This would have made way more sense, as the very cornerstone of Kylo Ren's character in these movies is his failure to live up to his grandfather. But then his redemption could have been the thing that made him most like Vader than anything bad he'd done. But no, we have to settle for a subversion of expectations because apparently that's better than logical writing. So because of this, they have to shoehorn Palpatine into episode 9 and have Ben being thrown down a hole whilst Rey kills Palpatine. Like, the knock-on effect Snoke's death had on this trilogy can't be overstated. This was, and still is, the dumbest thing they did for the continuity of this trilogy. Now, I just realized putting this video together that I completely forgot about Holdo and the Holdo maneuver. This character was inserted to force conflict to give Poe something to do in this movie. And the Holdo maneuver is a prime example of just because you could doesn't mean you should. They try to play this moment off as a 1 in a million maneuver, but what about this exactly is 1 in a million? You go into hyperspace in the direction of something. I'm not sure that's 1 in a million. I mean, we all know why they said that it was in The Rise of Skywalker, because it just opens up a massive plot hole regarding the entire franchise, so they have to play it off like it is 1 in a million, but we all know it's clearly not. That's just BS to just avoid a plot hole. But all of that just adds to this movie disrespecting the fact that it takes place in a pre-established universe with its own set of rules that it just casually breaks for fun. Like, there are so many things in this movie that just leave me scratching my head. Leia Poppins, I genuinely forgot how stupid that was. I don't think I could talk about this movie anymore. The Last Jedi really has slid for me. I was never its #1 advocate or anything, but I can't believe I have soured on it this much since the last time I saw it. The forced comedy, the cheesy dialogue, the disrespect for what came before and what needs to come after, the derailment of what was a promising trilogy. This movie is just a perfect example of how not to make a middle entry in a trilogy. The Rise of Skywalker. I mean, how did we get here? I mean, I just spent the last 30 minutes talking about how we got here, but anyway. It is crazy seeing a trilogy that had so much promise just end up stooping so low. The Rise of Skywalker was and still is a blueprint on how to not conclude a trilogy, how not to make a blockbuster film, how not to treat your audience. This movie genuinely acts like everyone watching it is stupid. This is a movie that is so fundamentally broken from top to bottom that I don't even know where to start. I do think The Rise of Skywalker is a far worse movie than The Last Jedi, as The Last Jedi's issues are mainly based around continuity, not respecting the established universe, not adhering to the fact it's part of a trilogy, and not its own separate thing. But The Rise of Skywalker, I think, fundamentally is just the worst written Star Wars film that's ever existed. You can make the argument that The Last Jedi is a good movie if you act like the rest of Star Wars does not exist. But The Rise of Skywalker is a bad movie from every conceivable angle. Half of it is its own doing, the other half is they have to follow up a film that went against everything the trilogy was setting up. So it had to retcon some dumb decisions The Last Jedi made to try and gain back some level of cohesion and damage control. So although I am sympathetic to the fact this movie has to conclude what is now a completely broken trilogy because of The Last Jedi, it still doesn't excuse how lazy and desperate this movie was. This movie is evidence that your movie doesn't need to be good to make $1 billion. Now, I held out a lot of hope that they were going to be able to save the sequel trilogy with The Rise of Skywalker. When I heard Palpatine laugh in that trailer, I was filled with levels of copium that should kill a man. It makes sense for Palpatine to come back to conclude the Skywalker saga, I used to say. Like, if I could get in a time machine and throw a brick at myself, I genuinely would. This is by far the most disconnected movie trilogy that has ever been put to screen. And this movie in general is just everything wrong with Hollywood. It's reliant on nostalgia to make up for straight up broken and contrived storytelling. It's lazy, it swings for the fences and misses by a mile and acts like it's a lot smarter than it is. Kind of like me. The answers for all of the questions we had in this movie were blatant retcons of the disappointing answers that we got in The Last Jedi. Character motivations simply do not match up with the previous films. The MacGuffins. Oh my god. The frickin' MacGuffins. One more contrived Sith dagger that lines up with the position of the Death Star ruins and I will scream. Things get to the point of parody too when things that haven't even been alluded to or foreshadowed in any way are all of a sudden a thing now and are played off like it's been the plan all along. Like, they had the nerve with this movie to act like Palpatine was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes the entire time when everyone knows that was not the case at all. Like, who are you fooling, Disney? Rey is a Palpatine now, and that's been the plan all along too. Yeah, nobody was buying that when the movie came out. No one's buying it now. Daisy Ridley literally came out and said that they had no idea who Rey's parents were the entire time because it kept changing.
Rey's secret from the beginning. Did you know about the parentage? Like, tell me about that journey of when you found out.
No. At the beginning, there was toying with like an Obi-Wan connection, and then it really went, there were like different versions, and then it really went to that she was no one. And then it came to episode 9, and JJ pitched me the film and was like, oh yeah, Palpatine's granddaddy. And I was like, awesome. And then 2 weeks later, he was like, oh, we're not sure. So it kept changing. So then even I was filming and I wasn't sure what the answer was going to be.
Like, imagine planning out a trilogy that can make you billions and literally be the biggest thing in Hollywood, and you don't even have a plan for where the freaking main character's going to go. You just do it off the cuff, depending on what each specific filmmaker wants, and don't rein them in the second things start not making sense. How the main character in a trilogy, how their lineage can change multiple times between 3 movies is insane. Like, the level of incompetence it had to take for them to blow the potential of this trilogy continues to astound me. You could actually tell how done the cast was with this movie during the press tour.
They fly now. He forgot. But what if that was the first time they used them? They're using them since the Clone Wars.
Like, they didn't even try to hide that they knew the movie was shit. Now, they didn't do the Dakota Johnson, Madam Web technique of straight up saying it was dog shit, but let's be real. Just watch the interviews. They said it without saying it. And a year after The Rise of Skywalker's release, John Boyega actually called Disney out for hiring him to check a box and then having no idea what to do with him. And I'm so glad that he did that, because they completely wasted both him as an actor and the character. Both had crazy potential. Finn had the potential to be one of the standout characters in this trilogy, and they completely tossed him to the side. Now, Disney are notorious for pandering and checking boxes when it suits them, and then dropping those morals when it comes to making money with their marketing campaigns. Remember when they shrunk down Finn on Chinese posters and they covered Black Panther's skin on Chinese posters? Yeah, a really weird way of saying you care. Good job, Disney. And I love the fact that John Boyega didn't care and he called Disney out on this shit. Actually, super based. They also went out of their way to actually have our new trio on screen together straight off the bat. Yeah, it only took until the last movie of a trilogy to have the three main characters together. I will say though, I did like the banter they shared, as it's clear the actors actually do have chemistry, but it's not hard to read between the lines that they're trying to make up for the lost time with the trio being separated. They also pushed Hux to the side because he went from at least somewhat intimidating to a little bitch in The Last Jedi, and brought in Richard E. Grant to actually play a convincing First Order general. Like, this guy was cool. He should have been there the whole time. This movie does play with some cool ideas despite how bad it is. I think the dyad idea that they followed up with from The Last Jedi was actually pretty great, but ultimately ends up being a waste of potential. There's those three words again. Like I said, I do like Rey and Kylo as a complicated duo, and I don't mean the Reylo shit. Like, that is just weird. Like, what is wrong with you people? I mean the genuine idea of a dyad and what they can do with it. It's cool, it's fresh, it's new, I like it. They played around with some cool ideas with it here. Their fight on Kijimi was actually visually interesting as a result, and expanded on the Skype calls they had in The Last Jedi. And Rey handing Ben the lightsaber to fight off the Knights of Ren was actually pretty cool. I know some people like to say this kind of stuff opens up plot holes, but to be honest, as these two are a dyad, which is super, super rare, I don't see this as being a problem. I really liked the dyad idea. I just think it was a little undercooked and they didn't do enough with it. I also think the style and aesthetic of Exegol is pretty great. It's just a shame it only exists because Disney got desperate and deployed the Palpatine. I also really liked the scene where Ben's redemption finally comes, but I don't even want to know how much money they had to throw at Harrison Ford to get him to come in for an afternoon of work. Oh, and they also gave Chewie his medal. Finally. 10 out of 10 masterpiece. Now, positives aside, I know there wasn't many, but positives aside regardless. So Kylo throughout this movie knows Rey is a Palpatine, which again doesn't make sense because Kylo said her parents were a nobody, which we now know thanks to Daisy Ridley that actually was the plan when The Last Jedi came out. There wasn't any underlying con here from Kylo. He was telling the truth. Her parents were a nobody. That was the situation. But because subverting expectations didn't go well with Star Wars fans, we're retroactively supposed to believe Kylo was telling a big porcupine here, a big old lie, when he wasn't. They just changed direction again between movies. Now, when you actually stop to think about literally anything in this movie, it just falls apart. For example, how did Palpatine have a fleet that big just sitting away on Exegol all this time when the previous movie made it clear that the First Order relies on warmongers to create their weaponry? But we're supposed to believe that Palpatine has made the biggest fleet the galaxy has ever seen with planet-destroying tech on every ship, and he's done it all in secret. Literally makes no sense. Where do those resources come from? Also, how were there any Death Star remains at all given it was completely pulverized in Return of the Jedi? How did Rey not know Chewie wasn't on the transport she blew up, but somehow knows he's on the Star Destroyer later in Kijimi? How did Lando manage to convince seemingly everyone in the galaxy to join the fight on Exegol when their distress signal in The Last Jedi was completely ignored? Like, the second you give anything in this movie any thought at all, you quickly realize it totally falls apart. Like, it's clear they were just making shit up as they went, and they clearly didn't even try. They cut corners, they took the easy way out. Half of it was definitely the result of The Last Jedi derailing the trilogy and them desperately scrambling to course correct. Which, I mean, technically is still their fault because they wouldn't tell Rian Johnson no and ticked off everything that movie did. And the other half of the equation is they were just trying to wrap this movie up and tried their best to get fans back on board with contrived writing, on-the-nose nods at the audience, and desperate nostalgia attempts. Oh yeah, Finn is force sensitive now, by the way. Apparently. For reasons I can't explain because the movie didn't, and this... whatever. Just whatever. Sure, why not? And then, of course, the movie ends on the cringiest moment in the entire franchise. And that's the end of the Skywalker saga. Like, oh man. Now, I of course can't finish this video without talking about Rey in this movie. She is so OP, it's not even funny. I guess they try and justify her power level because she's a Palpatine now, but the power scaling in this trilogy hasn't made sense the entire time. The fact that Rey single-handedly takes down Palpatine by sending his Force lightning back on him makes no sense, even if she does have all the power of the Jedi, which is just... what? This is the same thing that happened to Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith. He could just stop using Force lightning so she can't send it back on him, but no, he just keeps doing it until he dies, because reasons. At least in Revenge of the Sith, you could argue that Palpatine was doing it to force Anakin's hand to get him to finally turn, because Anakin needs Palpatine alive. But here, what is the reason? And why the hell would you not have been involved in this fight? Why would you flick him down a hole not to be seen until after Palpatine is dead? This is the last Skywalker. But in the writer's mind, I guess, why have Vader's grandson who idolized Vader help kill Palpatine just like his grandfather did to complete his arc in the trilogy and run a clear writing parallel when you can just throw him down a hole and not do anything? Kylo's goal this entire trilogy was to live up to his grandfather and went down a dark path to pursue that and kept failing. When he turns good, that's when you make him succeed by taking out Palpatine, just like Vader did. It was right there in front of you, and you didn't do it. So instead of logical writing happening, they take him out of the picture so Rey can have the hero moment. That is, until he comes back conveniently when it's over to just bring Rey back to life so he can die. Like, was Adam Driver sleeping with J.J. Abrams' wife throughout filming or something? Like, Ben got shafted in this ending. I hated this. This is the best character in the trilogy by a mile, and he just gets ditched off to the side when it comes to fighting Palpatine. The main thing that would have made sense for closure on the character. Not to mention, Rey goes from random scavenger to killing Palpatine in 1 year. Let that sink in. That is insane. Palpatine is like the most powerful Force user we've seen. And Rey kills him after using the Force for a year. Like, it's... what are they doing? Now, on a slightly more positive note, I will say I think they handled Leia's death as well as they possibly could. When an actor so integral passes away before filming, there's only so much you can really do if you're not recasting. The fact they made anything work at all, I think deserves some level of praise. But watching through the movie, it is very clear that they had to make compromises with Leia in this movie because a lot of things just don't really make sense. I do like that they at least tried to tie her death into Kylo's redemption in a way, and I don't really dock points for the Leia scenes not working out the best in this movie. They were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place with this, and they did what they could. Overall though, I think The Rise of Skywalker is just a bad movie through and through, with some decent moments, but ultimately, it's a symptom of The Last Jedi. It's torn between damage control and trying to wrap up the story, and it's a mess. It was a desperate attempt to get fans back on board, and unfortunately, a lot of people fell for it, including me. This film made $1 billion. I saw the movie in theaters twice. Yes, I hope that I step on Lego too for my treachery. What I can say with confidence though is I don't think I'll ever watch this movie again, or any of the sequels for that matter, because it just gets more and more depressing seeing the potential of this trilogy just being completely wasted. And life is honestly better when you pretend that these movies never even happened. So, revisiting the Star Wars sequels after all this time was definitely an experience. I'm glad I finally got to go into detail on these movies on the channel, as they remind me of a time when I actually cared about Star Wars enough to go to the midnight screenings of these movies. But the sequel trilogy ultimately still stands as the biggest waste of potential I've ever seen in Hollywood, and a blueprint on how to not make a trilogy.